A huge turnout across Colombia for the national strike against the government of Iván Duque. The Bolivian police fired tear gas at coffin bearers in La Paz as another big march arrives from El Alto to oppose the coup. And Israel's Attorney General charges Benjamin Netanyahu with corruption. He's the first serving prime minister to be indicted. Hello and welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo and this is From the South. Thousands of Colombians are staging a national strike against the killing of social and indigenous leaders and the neoliberal administration of Iván Duque. The protests are being led by social movements, unions, and students who are demanding that the government respects their rights. They're also condemning labor and education reforms that disproportionately affect the poorest in Colombia. Meanwhile, demonstrators also slammed the government's failure to implement the 2016 peace accord. The Institute for Development and Peace says 777 social leaders have been killed since the signing of the agreement, including 137 former FARC combatants.
Salgo a marchar por la defensa de la madre tierra.
I am here, marching in defense of Mother Earth, defense of life, defense of the poor, defense of the rights of Colombians, the campesinos, the Afro-descendants, the unions, the students. This is a multicolored march with 1,000 colors for the dignity of the Colombian people and the indigenous people here and all across the world, for our dignity as indigenous people, for the dignity of Colombians, to defend rights and Mother Earth.
The national stoppage saw demonstrations right across Colombia. This was a march by the Wayuu indigenous people in the impoverished Guajira region of the far north. But there were also protests in Guavire and other remote areas of the Amazon region and the south. One of the biggest marches was in Colombia's third city of Cali, where tens of thousands flocked into the city. The rural areas in this part of the country have seen some of the worst violence in recent months, with many indigenous and other social leaders being murdered. And towards the end of the day, the police launched violent attacks on those they called vandals in some of Cali's poor neighborhoods. The governor of the state then declared a curfew. Our correspondent Hernán Tovar has more from Bogotá.
There
have been some disturbances during the national strike here in Bogotá, especially on the road that leads to the airport. Some students were marching towards the airport and the police blocked their way and there were clashes there. But when we traveled through other parts of the center of the city, the protests were entirely peaceful. There were no clashes and the riot police, the ESMAD, were nowhere to be seen. The central square, the Plaza Bolívar, was absolutely packed with trade unionists, students, indigenous movements, environmentalists. In fact, many protesters couldn't get into the square, and even the rain didn't drive people away. It was really one of the biggest demonstrations we've seen for a very long time in Colombia. And of course, there were big demonstrations across the country as well. The demands focused on an end to genocide, the murders of community leaders, no to the tax reform, no to the labor reform. But there were many other specific demands coming together in this national strike too.
We thank Hernán Tovar for that report, and several protests in solidarity with Colombia are taking place in major cities around the world. Protesters have gathered outside Colombia's embassy in London in support of the national strike in the South American country. They're voicing their dissatisfaction with the response of the Iván Duque-led administration to massacres of social leaders, indigenous peoples, rural women, and their communities. Another big march against the de facto government in Bolivia has been met with repression in La Paz. Campesinos from Potosí joined the march as it set off from El Alto. They chanted, "El Alto is not alone." Citizens from across the country are rejecting the right-wing coup d'etat deposing President Evo Morales. The march is being led by the families of those killed in a military and police operation against the peaceful blockade of a fuel depot in the town of Sencata. 72 roadblocks have been set up across Bolivia, primarily in the regions of La Paz, Cochabamba, and Santa Cruz, as citizens continue to contest the authority of the de facto government.
Is this democracy? No, it isn't. They are murderers.
Agnes, you have sent them to kill people. Agnes, you won't be in power forever. And when you aren't, we will deal with you.
The army and the police are killing people with bullets. This is a coup government, and that is why they have to resign. Resign and free all those who have been unjustly locked up. Because if not, the people of El Alto, who represent all our nationalities, are going to rise up.
As the coffins of the victims were approaching the San Francisco Square in the center of La Paz, the police began firing tear gas to disperse the crowds, but the crowds say they will not stop protesting. Our correspondent in La Paz, Freddy Morales, has the latest.
Here in Prado Avenue, we've just seen a very intense tear gas operation by the police. A very large march by residents of El Alto, especially from the Sencata neighborhood, and other social movements, had just arrived in the center of La Paz after walking 19 kilometers. They were carrying at least 3 coffins of those who were killed 2 days ago at the fuel depot in Sencata. They spoke to the soldiers who were there, and they let them pass, because they wanted to hold a procession with the coffins through the city. But then very suddenly and surprisingly, the police who were behind the soldiers started attacking the crowd, including the relatives of the victims. The tear gas was very intense and the crowd retreated. We saw at least 3 people taken away, suffering from respiratory problems. The protesters continued to the San Francisco Square, where there was more tear gas.
And the Bolivian Legislative Assembly lawmakers have been discussing steps to call for new elections. The majority movement towards socialism has reportedly come to an agreement with Bolivia's de facto authorities on the measures needed to speed up the electoral process. Students have been marching in Venezuela to support the Bolivarian Revolution on University Students' Day. The march set off from 2 sites in Caracas. The Chavista students expressed their support for the policies that have made university education available to young people from poorer communities. They also held cultural activities in support of indigenous people in Venezuela and Latin America. Coming up, the Dominican Labour Party says it is ready for Decision Day on December 6th. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. The Dominican Labour Party says it is ready for Decision Day on December 6th. Although the situation remains tense on the island following Monday's violent protests on the eve of Nomination Day, the ruling party is pushing ahead with its election preparations. The electoral office says the nomination process went well and there were no incidents of direct interference. Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit says all 21 of the ruling party's candidates have been nominated for the upcoming polls. During protests earlier this week in Dominica's capital, demonstrators were calling for the implementation of electoral reforms, which were dictated by the Organization of American States at a meeting in August. Critics have accused the organization of meddling in Dominica's affairs. In a recent tweet on the heels of the demonstrations, OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro called for an observer mission for the country's upcoming election. A poll conducted in October by the Caribbean Development Research Services has found that the majority of those surveyed plan to vote for the ruling Dominican Labour Party, but the Caturist director said undecided voters could change the outcome.
What we found is that 48% of people interviewed said they expected the DLP to win the December 6 elections, while 25% said they expected the UWP to win the elections, and 27% said they were unsure who will win. This conveys a sense that certainly Dominicans expect the DLP to be victorious, but it should be noted that it was not necessarily an expression of voting intention at this time. The actual voting intention data was compiled based on a question that asked respondents the party or candidate that they proposed to support, and here 37% were committed to the DLP, which is Labour, while 30% were committed to the UWP, and 1% said another party. Now, my presumption is that since this poll was done before nomination day, people were at this time, certainly 1% of people believe that there would be another entity that would materialize. That has certainly not since materialized.
Meanwhile, security checks have been increased for Dominicans landing in Antigua and Barbuda in the wake of the unrest on the island. A memo issued by Antigua's Customs Division the day after protests erupted in Dominica reads, effective immediately, all passengers and goods coming out of Dominica via all ports of entry must be subject to 100% examination. Antigua and Barbuda's embattled police commissioner Wendell Robinson has requested a transfer to another position within the public service. This as he faces imminent termination by the Police Service Commission. Robinson was suspended in April of 2018 after 3 junior policemen accused him of sexual harassment and inappropriate conduct. The alleged incidents are said to have occurred between 2016 and February of 2018. As part of his transfer request, Robinson has asked that any new position is commensurate with his current rank, and he's also requested the use of a service government vehicle.
For their support, and will still continue.
Barbados cabinet is to expand the categories of people who can become Barbadians. It would be the most sweeping change in the pathway to citizenship since the island's independence in 1966. By January, a new bill to amend the Immigration Act will go before the Parliament. Key changes announced by the Home Affairs Minister include citizenship being made available to a grandchild or a great-grandchild of a Barbadian citizen. Currently, only parents are allowed to grant citizenship by descent. The minister cited a declining population, a growing elderly group that impacts national insurance scheme funds, and a need for economic growth. While electricity has been restored across Barbados following 2 days of power outages earlier this week, water shortages still persist. The island's Water Resources Minister explains that many reservoirs are at low capacity and major restoration work will be carried out.
We are getting in the process of finalizing a CDB loan and a contract to restore, I think, 11 or 12 of the reservoirs, but our reservoirs in Barbados are in a real bad condition, in a very, very bad condition. We expect to have the current reservoirs that we're repairing completed, that we're replacing entirely, completed by the end of January. So those who are serviced by the Fort George Reservoir that have been experiencing some issues over the last 6 or 7 months, that's the reason. The reservoir cannot be filled past 1/3 capacity. That obviously affects the pressure in the reservoir, so it affects the delivery of water to people being serviced by that reservoir.
In Brazil, Sao Paulo state legislature has rejected a motion by a right-wing congressman to honor former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet. Our correspondent has more.
São Paulo State Congressman Frederica Davila just put in a request to hold a memorial honoring former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet inside of the São Paulo State Legislature on December 10th, on International Human Rights Day. Now, Frederico Davila is someone who's very strongly connected to the ruralist or big plantation and agribusiness interests within the Brazilian government. He helped far-right President Jair Bolsonaro develop his plan for agribusiness, which involves ripping down huge amounts of Amazon rainforest, which has led to the crisis that we see underway in that region right now. And he worked with former governor of São Paulo, Geraldo Alckmin from the PSDB party, on his strategy for agribusiness. So he's someone very connected to the base of the Bolsonaro government. Now, he tried to push through this memorial service in a tricky way. He filed for the request for the service using Pinochet's lesser-known second name. He filed it as a day honoring President Augusto P. Ugarte. And apparently it slipped by some of the people in Congress, but now State Congressional President Kawe Makris from the PSDB party says he's going to try to block the initiative, and the ambassador from Chile to Brazil also said that the government of Chile protests against this. It goes against what it's trying to do right now, reconciling the country in this moment of extreme protests, most of which are rooted in anger against policies that were initiated during Pinochet's bloody regime.
We thank Brian Muir for that report. With the participation of more than 300 delegates from 26 countries, the 7th International Meeting on Agroecology and Sustainable Agriculture is taking place in Cuba. The event aims to promote the exchange of knowledge on food production through agroecological practices.
The World Forum on Agroecology includes tours of the Cuban countryside. For this reason, agroecologists and campesinos from 10 countries arrived at the Marta farm, an agroecological family project in Caimito, about 30 kilometers from Habana. Fernando Funes explains the agroecological strategy of Cuba and his farm, but first he presents the products he gets from the land, like arugula, lettuce, chard, chicory, spinach, and peppers.
For me, what these systems promote is food sovereignty. With the principles that we have learned here, and with organoponic orchards, we can share this knowledge to promote an adequate habitat for a dignified life in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala.
A doctor in ecological agriculture shows the harvest of the day, with the authority that his theoretical and practical experience give him. He assures that agroecology is not at odds with modernization, nor with new technologies, adding that it is necessary to integrate resources, water, energy, and nutrients to adapt to climate change. But above all, change mentalities to achieve a balance with nature.
In spite of everything that happens with my government, we support the Cuban people in their struggle in agroecology. What is happening with the campesino movement in regards to seed autonomy and the practices of their traditional agriculture, we can exchange ideas. Things that I have seen here in this farm, I can apply in the farms that we have in California.
8 years ago, this farm had no water or electricity. The soil was rocky and of low fertility. Residents made this well, and they activated the soil, applying organic matter. They speak of biological means for fertilization and control of plagues, of renewable energies, and the production of biogas for the cooking of foods.
We speak of sustainability, we speak of resilience, we speak of sovereignty, of all the aspirations of socialism, of a socialist society that seeks to put the human being at the center of all its concerns, with respect for the environment.
Today, these are the results at the Marta farm. Funes proudly shows the 100 beehives from which honey he exports to Europe comes. The future, to establish other farms in the territory, to contribute to the search for a sustainable life.
We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Israel's Attorney General has indicted Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on bribery, breach of trust, and fraud charges. The charges are the culmination of an investigation launched in 2016 into 3 separate corruption cases. In the indictment, Netanyahu was accused of accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in luxury gifts from billionaire friends and of trading favors with Israeli media moguls for positive news coverage. He has denied these allegations, saying he has been the target of a politically motivated witch hunt designed to drive him out of office. The Attorney General announced his decision on Netanyahu's indictment.
This day is a difficult and sad day. Today I inform the representatives of the Prime Minister, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, about my decision to try him under an indictment that includes 3 charges, a day in which the Attorney General decides to serve an indictment against a seated Prime Minister for serious crimes of corrupt governance is a heavy and sad day for the Israeli public and for me personally.
In response, Netanyahu has denounced his indictment on corruption allegations, calling it a coup attempt against him.
This evening we're witnessing an attempted coup against the Prime Minister, with false charges and a contaminated investigation process. I think you need to be blind in order not to see that something wrong is going on among the police investigators and the prosecution.
Earlier, the Israeli security forces arrested the Palestinian governor of Jerusalem, Adnan Gait. Heavily armed men detained Gait at his home in the occupied Selwan neighborhood. Authorities have not provided any reason for his arrest other than a vague statement saying he has been apprehended for Palestinian activity in Jerusalem. Gait has been detained more than 5 times since January. A measles outbreak declared in June has killed almost 5,000 people in the Democratic Republic of Congo so far this year. The World Health Organization says this is the world's largest and fastest moving epidemic, with close to 250,000 people infected in 2019 after the disease spread to all the country's provinces. An emergency vaccination program launched by the government and WHO in September aimed to immunize more than 800,000 children, but failed due to poor infrastructure, attacks on health centers, and a lack of access to routine health care. The British Labour Party has unveiled its manifesto ahead of the United Kingdom's December 12th general election. Party leader Jeremy Corbyn said it was the most radical manifesto Labour had ever presented. Progressive policies outlined in the manifesto included a tax of over $13 billion on fossil fuel firms in order to fund a green economy, and a promise to build 100,000 new social housing units a year.
Labour's manifesto is a manifesto for hope. That is what this document is. A manifesto that will bring real change. A manifesto that's full of popular policies that the political establishment has blocked for a generation. But you can't have it. At least that's what the most powerful people in Britain and their supporters want you to believe. Over the next 3 weeks, they're going to tell you that everything in this manifesto is impossible, that it's too much for you, because they do not want real change in this country. Why would they? The system is working just fine for them. It's rigged in their favour. But it's not working for you.
Ankara has accused the United States and Russia of failing to comply with the agreements reached on the withdrawal of Kurdish militias from northern Syria near the border with Turkey. Let's take a look.
The Russian Ministry of Defense warned that Ankara's statement could provoke an escalation of tensions in northern Syria, and clarified that since October 22, in addition to the Russian-Turkish patrol 10 kilometers from the border, the deployment of Russian military police and Syrian soldiers in the area continues, as does the withdrawal of Kurdish militias at a distance of 30 kilometers from the borderline.
The accusations from Turkey do not match with reality, as the implementation of the agreement continues as does the withdrawal of the Turkish militias, so that any new military action by Turkey on Syrian territory will undoubtedly lead to a clash between their troops and the troops of the Syrian Arab Army.
Kurdish militias facing the Turkish offensive expressed their interest in dialogue with Damascus through Russia and say that they're against the division of Syria, a position that arose after Washington decided to abandon the separatist factions and focus its interest on the looting of Syrian oil.
The dialogue between the central government in Damascus and the leaders of the autonomous administration and the Syrian Democratic Forces is currently the only solution to deal with the Turkish offensive. It's necessary that the dialogue leads to the formation of a joint military command center to help organize military as well as political coordination.
Meanwhile, on the ground, although Turkish troops temporarily suspended air and artillery bombings, the fighters of the so-called armed opposition, supported by Turkey, did not stop attacking northern Syria, something which shows that the incursion that Ankara threatened to resume never actually stopped.
And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Until next time.